Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our first session of day 3 of the National Climate Adaptation Summit, a collaboration between Future Earth Australia, the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University, and the Sydney Environment Institute at the University of Sydney. We did an acknowledgement of country at the beginning of the day, which hopefully will be an acknowledgement for the whole day. But I'll just quickly say that I'm speaking from Gadigal country in Tempe in Sydney, and we pay respects to Indigenous Aboriginal elders, past, present, and emerging. We have a very important first session with tremendous speakers. The session is called Climate Adaptation's Futures. And I'll introduce our 4 speakers who are going to be presenting on a range of perspectives on why climate adaptation and resilience require a strong focus on social and cultural practices and a diversity of modes of knowledges to create effective future adaptation pathways. The first speaker will be Councillor Mark Greenhill, OAM, who has been a Blue Mountain City Councillor for 17 years, 7 of which he has served as mayor. In 2016, Councillor Greenhill was awarded a Medal of the Order of Australia for services to local government and to the Blue Mountains community. He has steered many projects to honour and maintain the Blue Mountains status as World Heritage Park, including an ethical investment strategy, community conservation programs, reducing waste to landfill, and increasing resource recovery. A co-worker space in Katoomba's town centre to stimulate the local economy, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and a visitor infrastructure investment to manage the impact of increased tourism on forest reserves. Following Mark, we will have Professor Lesley Head, Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and a Fellow of the Academy of Humanities. She's a Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor at the University of Melbourne and President of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. Professor Head is an international leader in geographical debates about the relationship between humans and nature. From 2009 to 2014, she was an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow and Director of the Australian Centre for Cultural and Environmental Research at the University of Wollongong. In recent years, her research focus has been on ethically diverse environmental knowledge, backyard gardens, wheat, and invasive plants. Her latest ARC-funded research is investigating the social and cultural benefits of market-based environmental policy instruments for carbon and water. And she's been doing case studies in the Murray-Darling Basin, Kakadu, and Timor-Leste. Following Lesley, we will have Professor Jean Palutikof, who is Professor in Climate Change at Griffith University and former Director of the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility at Griffith University, which has been mentioned on a few occasions over the last 3 years. Professor Palutikof now manages a project on present-day and future heat stress among workers in ready-made garment factories in Bangladesh. Prior to 2008, she worked at the UK Met Office, managing the preparation of the Working Group 2 for Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability for the 4th assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And prior to that, she had a role as at the Climate Research Unit in the University of East Anglia. Following Jean, we will have Dr. Russ Weiss, who is a Principal Sustainability Economist at CSIRO in Canberra. Over the last 15 years, Russ has led transdisciplinary R&D programs focused on designing and implementing systems and values-based approaches to diagnosing and managing complex challenges in climate adaptation and in disaster risk reduction. Russ has also undertaken this work in diverse contexts, not only in Australia, but also in Indonesia, PNG, and South Africa. And he was seconded to the National Resilience Task Force in 2017 and 2018, where he led the development of the guidance on strategic climate and disaster risk. He's currently leading a national initiative focused on building the enabling conditions for large-scale investment in adaptation and DRR in Australia. It's been the case with the previous 2 days. Each of the speakers will have 10 minutes to present, then we will have 10 to 15 minutes a moderated conversation, followed by questions from the audience for another 10 or 15 minutes. So without further ado, thank you so much to our 4 speakers. Your presence in this conference makes the conference better. So Mark Greenhill, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and can I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, including the traditional owners of the Blue Mountains, the Darug and the Gundungurra peoples, and pay my deepest respects to elders past, present and future. Blue Mountains City Council was one of the first councils in the state of New South Wales to declare a climate emergency. Climate change and sustainability is at the centre of our local government's strategic planning, and it has been for many years. Last summer, we experienced an unprecedented bushfire season, and our city faced fires on 3 fronts. And sadly, during my time as mayor, this wasn't the first time we experienced something like this. We've in fact experienced 2 devastating bushfire seasons. In the year 2013, I should say, we lost more than 200 homes in less than 2 hours from a fire that ripped through parts of the Blue Mountains. And I witnessed firsthand the destruction that fires supercharged by climate change can cause to our community and to our environment. My primary message to you is that we are seeing the effects of climate change right now. It's supercharging the natural disasters we are seeing around us in Australia at the moment. And for the sake of both humanity and the natural world, my call is that we all must act. So what's being done in the City of Blue Mountains in climate adaptation? Well, Blue Mountain City Council is acting to combat climate change in a number of specific and practical ways. Firstly, we've committed to being carbon neutral by 2021, and our carbon abatement action plan was endorsed in 2016 by our governing body. And our most recent results show that we have already reduced our annual carbon operational footprint by a massive 25% in that time. We've just completed our 5th major solar project on council facilities, and we have upgraded nearly 3,000 streetlights to LED. The full reduction in emissions from these projects hasn't been seen, but will be part of our 21 to 22 carbon footprint calculations. Not only are these reductions great news for our environment, but they contribute to Council's long-term financial plan to reduce operating costs across the whole of our organisation. So there's an economic benefit as well. In 2017, it was identified that a major barrier for our council to invest in carbon reduction initiatives was a lack of funding. In response to this, a carbon revolving reserve was established. Now, a significant benefit of this type of revolving reserve is that it is ongoing. So once an investment has been made, the financial savings achieved are diverted back into the reserve. Our Carbon Revolving Reserve, our CRR, won the National Cities Power Partnership Award in 2019 for project financing innovation. Other Blue Mountain City Council initiatives to combat climate change include: we are trialling the use of electric vehicles in our council fleet of over 300 vehicles and trucks. We're encouraging our residents also to take a path to zero emissions. We regularly provide information to residents on how they can do this, including information about emergency efficiency, using renewables, insulating homes, looking at fuel and transport efficiency and reducing waste. We're also at the forefront of activity on community resilience in the face of disasters. Our expertise with bushfires enables us to lead national conversations about strengthening resilience and recovery through better emergency preparedness, mapping areas of vulnerability, and connecting local communities with emergency organisations. Blue Mountain City Council will present the 7th Annual Australian Bushfire Building Conference in August this year. And we care for our planet in a multitude of ways. We protect and restore biodiversity. The Greater Blue Mountains World Heritage Area has 160 rare or threatened plants and animals, including species. We protect our waterways. We're currently enacting an award-winning water-sensitive Blue Mountain Strategic Plan, which will be our blueprint for water management over the next decade. We ensure sustainable planning and development. We have embedded sustainability into our award-winning strategic planning. We recognise traditional owners and sustainable resource management practices that they have used for millennia. And we work closely with Darug and Gundungurra traditional owners to care for country, which enhances the values of our World Heritage Area. I think we're moving on to the second slide now. As one of only 2 cities in the world located within a World Heritage Area, the city of Blue Mountains holds special significance, not only within Australia, but around the world. Incidentally, the other city is Banff in Canada. And I was there the day World Heritage Area status was announced. I'll never forget that moment. Managing an area of such spectacular natural beauty and cultural importance is both a privilege, but it's also a very unique responsibility. And our council is responsible for managing significant natural assets that underpin the identity and health of the region, including 10,000 hectares of bushland, 300 kilometres of creeks, 20 hectares of open freshwater bodies, and 500 hectares of endangered ecological communities. As a steward of a city within a World Heritage National Park, we manage the impact of development on the environment. We protect and conserve World Heritage natural values and protect the health of drinking water catchments for Greater Sydney. So why should local government play a leading role in combating climate change? Well, in my view, and I'm biased, but local government is the level of government that's closest to the people. And I think that puts us in the best position to consider all matters that influence the health of a community and a city. Because, councils look at a local area in an integrated way. That integrated way encompasses the social, the economic, as well as environmental factors. I've been frankly disappointed by the lack of leadership that we've seen from the Australian government on action on climate change. And I realised some time ago that local government has to take a stand. We're living in a new era now with intense bushfire seasons that start earlier and continue longer, as well as other extreme weather events. And frankly, the time for change is now. I think we're moving on to the next slide. So looking after our planet and combating climate change is a global imperative. It's a matter for all people on Earth, but particularly it resonates with the people of the Blue Mountains. Council's existing and future partnerships are critical in helping us to contribute to the health of our planet and combat climate change. This includes the Cities Power Partnership. Now, Blue Mountain City Council was among the first 100 councils to sign up to what is now Australia's largest local government climate initiative to assist Australia's towns and cities make the switch to clean energy. The Western Sydney Energy Program, we joined 9 Western Sydney councils to launch the Western Sydney Energy Program, which aims to reduce Western Sydney's emissions by 200,000 tonnes of CO2 per year. Resilient Sydney, we are one of 33 councils involved in developing Resilience Sydney, the first resilience strategy for metropolitan Sydney. And our city is soon becoming an internationally accredited eco destination, thanks to the Eco Destination Certification Program. Also, Blue Mountain City Council is proudly partnering with Western Sydney University and the Monash Sustainable Development Institute to develop an international centre for excellence in the Blue Mountains in the fields of sustainable living, environmental science and planetary health. Blue Mountains City Council is working closely with our community to create a resilient and sustainable future. Our huge network of volunteers are doing valuable work in this space. We have over 500 local volunteers and 600 local school students who are working on bush regeneration and waterways projects directly themselves across the Blue Mountains. And this number continues to grow annually. We've partnered with Resilient Blue Mountains, a community-led network that aims to help equip our community, infrastructure and environment with the resources needed to tackle the climate crisis. This collaborative approach has already seen areas of opportunity, with councils successfully receiving state and federal funding to host a Festival of Resilience in the Blue Mountains this year. We're working closely with the local business community to reach zero food waste in towns in the upper Blue Mountains through auditing, engagement and communication with local residents, visiting tourists and businesses more generally. We're developing a sustainable living toolkit that helps to support the community to implement sustainable living activities at the household and local levels. We recognise the crucial role our community itself plays in helping us to combat climate change and create a sustainable future. So in conclusion, I was honoured to be awarded the National Climate Ambassador Award in 2020. Blue Mountain City Council and I will continue to drive climate action in consultation with our community and keep climate on the national agenda. Can I thank you all very much for having me today?
Thank you very much, Mark, for your intervention, and we'll come back to your views in a minute. Next up is Professor Lesley Head.
Thanks very much, Juan, and thanks everyone for attending. I'm speaking to you from Wurundjeri country this morning. The reimagination that I want to focus on today involves overlapping catastrophes, the overlapping crises of climate change and COVID. So I want to ask, under what conditions can crisis be transformative or generative? And my answer will be that we can reimagine adaptation by thinking more carefully about the relationships between everyday life and emergency. But first, let's step back a bit and look at this first slide. I wrote a comment on the Black Summer bushfires for Nature Climate Change in January 2020, which seems like a lifetime ago now, about whether or not we had a political moment to act on climate change. And I argued that a number of processes could catalyse change. On the left of the slide here, the sheer scale and impact of the fires, the intense emotions that were expressed in the public sphere at that time, the connections of care to wider ecologies that were expressed, particularly around the loss of billions of animals, the possible alternative approaches provided by Indigenous cultural burning practices, and the attention and pressure from the international community. On the other hand, on the right-hand side of this slide, a set of processes was acting against change and towards absorption into a new normal, acting in a kind of conservative influence, if you like. This included the everyday nature of the catastrophe. It was still recognisable as everyday life. The national trope of resilience to droughts and flooding rains, the so-called Dorothea McKellar response. The framing of disasters as natural without acknowledgement of the human input to those disasters, and the morphing of climate change denialist claims at that time. So these two entwined processes led to what's been referred to as a double reality in rich, well-educated countries like Australia. Climate change can be held at a distance. It is both common knowledge and unimaginable. Now, in some ways, that writing and thinking seems like a comment from another world, as COVID happened just after this piece was published. The unimaginable, in fact, occurred. Things that had seemed impossible, like grounding global aviation or emptying our cities of cars, happened. Further, the crisis of the pandemic exposed lines of vulnerability and injustice in our society that had always lingered below the surface but became impossible to ignore. So it's worth exploring the connective tissue, I think, between climate change adaptation and COVID. The question of the everyday and the emergency being to the fore. If we could go to the second slide. So I draw on the concept of slow emergencies as developed by Ben Anderson and colleagues. They started with the example of the nuclear tests in Maralinga several decades ago to challenge the notion of an emergency being a punctual event inducing an immediate response as being starkly inadequate. Slow emergencies are often racialised, and we can think of Aboriginal deaths in custody as another example. Now, there are four relevant characteristics of slow emergency. The first one is what they call attritional lethality, and they're drawing here on Rob Nixon's idea of slow violence. So slow emergencies are likewise defined by forms of harm and damage that are not punctual and acute, but rather occur gradually and out of sight. Secondly, slow emergencies are often rendered imperceptible as events, even as they emerge, surface, and are endured as a series of palpable bodily and psychic effects. So slow emergencies don't register as exceptional events demanding a collective political or ethical response, in part because the intense dramatic vocab of emergency often doesn't fit with how people live through these slow emergencies at the interface of being stalled in their lives and experiencing disaster in their lives. So I think both bushfires and COVID, we can connect with this idea as well. As the everyday and the emergency blur and become indistinct, and as that lethality wears bodies down while remaining imperceptible as an event, slow emergencies are situations in which the promise of a future of progress and betterment is no longer, if it ever was, on offer. So the capacity to become otherwise, the capacity of a hopeful future, if you like, is foreclosed. And fourth, situations become slow emergencies through projects by publics, artists and activists that attempt to turn them into events demanding some sort of response. So a claim of emergency carries power, it carries the fragile promise that a different future is possible. So it's a way of galvanizing action and attention. And Anderson and others argue that a starting point is to listen to claims of emergency issued from marginalised peoples within racialising assemblages. So I want to consider how generative or transformative change might emerge if we can bring the everyday and the emergency together. Or another way to think about it is if we can bring slow and fast emergencies together. Can we reimagine adaptation by thinking more carefully about the relationships between everyday life and emergency? If everyday norms are part of what is inhibiting large-scale political and economic change, then shifting them can help to mobilise change. So what have been the shifts in everyday experience that we've had recently? In the bushfires, we had the reconfiguration, the Black Summer bushfires I'm talking about, the reconfiguration of summer from a time of leisure and relaxation to one of vigilance and anxiety. We had the emergence of urban air quality as a major health issue for the first time in the fires. In the pandemic, we've had the experience of being confined to home, of the workplace invading the home, and of being separated from friends and family. Third slide, please. So I want to suggest that the transformative or the generative potential of the crisis arises out of bringing the everyday and the emergency together. There are at least three important ways to do this, and I'm drawing here also on the work of Kari Norgard in Norway and others. First, we should articulate rather than express our emotions, rather than suppress our emotions about climate change, acknowledging that emotional responses of grief, fear and anger are realistic rather than irrational. Both the Black Summer and the COVID pandemic have given us an expanded repertoire of publicly permissible feelings, articulated in a torrent of writing and discussion that collectively resist the new normal. And I think we've also had a much more public discussion around mental health as part of both of these. Second, we've expanded the spheres in which climate change conversations can occur, and we should continue to prosecute these in everyday life. A lot of the research suggests that an important way to generate action on climate change is actually to talk about it more than we do in our domestic and work settings. In so doing, we'll counteract the political silence and expand rather than diminish the public sphere. Third, we should acknowledge that working to strengthen the social fabric and enhance social justice is de facto strengthening our collective capacities to adapt to climate change, whether or not climate is mentioned and whether or not the environment is mentioned. And I think Mark's Mark's talk gave us lots of examples of that happening in the Blue Mountains. Or conversely, we can think that reducing social justice reduces our adaptive capacities. We can see this very clearly at the moment with low-income rural communities still struggling after the bushfires. Indigenous communities and cultural burning were both brought into the public discussion and also marginalised in some ways. And finally, I'm sure lots of people listening here have also got some great ideas on this. So look forward to hearing from you in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lesley. Next up is Jean Palutikof.
Thank you, Juan. I'm now on my mobile phone because I lost my internet connection. So hopefully you can hear me well. And like Mark, I hope my battery holds up. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners. Here I'm on Kombumerri land, and I acknowledge the traditional owners and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I wanted to spend some time today talking about the delivery of knowledge and information for adaptation. And much of what I'm going to say is taken from the Science Adaptation Policy Brief that you can now see on your screen. This was produced for the World Adaptation Science Programme, and I'd like to acknowledge my co-author on this policy brief, Roger Street, who will be known to many of you. So it's a mantra for designers that their products should be useful, usable and used. And just as it's a mantra for designers of cups, saucers and products way up to aircraft and even aircraft carriers, it should also be for those responsible for the generation and delivery of information and knowledge to adaptation practitioners. So what I wanted to look at briefly today is how good are we at being useful, usable and used? Are we getting better at it? And where are we headed in the future? So let's look first at useful. An immediate problem for anyone thinking about knowledge generation and delivery, let's call those people the developers, is the sheer diversity that adaptation encompasses in terms of activity from nature conservation through to infrastructure protection, and in terms of scale from a single farm in the Liverpool Plains through to multinational reinsurance companies responsible for billion-dollar portfolios of property. It's most certainly the case that one size does not fit all. Generally, where the values at risk are large and the exposure is high, then those responsible will generate for themselves highly specific and tailored information for their needs. Thus, reinsurance companies such as Munich Re and Swiss Re will directly employ climate specialists and statisticians to evaluate risk and deliver information in appropriate formats for use by their underwriters. The same, of course, is not true for the small commercial players, the single farmers, the mom and pop tourism enterprises, and it's also not true for non-commercial interests such as in local government, health and social services. For some of these smaller scale users, the first step may be to recognise that they and their stakeholders are exposed to risk from climate change. Only then can there be a conversation around what could be done about those risks and eventually what information could help to support the planning process. So there is information which is general, generic, and which is useful to decision makers trying to adapt to the risks from climate change, especially the small scale variety, about the broad risks from climate change, looking at natural hazards and how they will evolve over time, at sea level rise and what this will mean for coastal flooding in the future. For some users, this may be sufficient to allow decisions to be made, for example, to install air conditioning in homes and schools because warmer summers are not going to go away. These needs can be fulfilled through decision support platforms and tools such as Coast Adapt and the Climate Resilience Toolkit in the US. Such platforms may be sector specific and generally government funded. So in the slide in front of you, you can see on the right-hand side, it's a diagram taken from the policy brief, the general characteristics of such decision support tools, that they bring together a risk assessment framework with a diversity of information and also, most importantly, perhaps with case studies, which help practitioners to decide on the basis of what their peers have experienced, what is the best way to proceed. If I could have the next slide, please, Elise. And this shows you some examples, as I've just mentioned, of decision support platforms available here in Australia and in the US. So what I'm talking about today is this kind of platform. If properly constructed, it's a big if, it can be a useful method to deliver information to adaptation practitioners. User needs, of course, evolve very rapidly. For some decision makers, there comes a need for much more specialized information that can no longer be fulfilled by a decision support platform, which generally delivers in one direction from the developer to the practitioner. When complex decisions are to be made in the context of an uncertain future, there arises the need for a dialogue in a one-to-one partnership between information provider and recipient. Decision support platforms can broker these partnerships, providing links to consultants and experts, but then broader questions arise. Who should pay? Is the information sufficiently certain as a basis for decision makers? For example, to take the big decisions to maybe relocate a vineyard or production of a crop such as peanuts. Who owns the data? And if things go wrong, who is liable? Secondly, is the information and knowledge delivered by mechanisms such as decision support platforms usable? In the early days of information provision for adaptation decision support, there was very much a top-down mentality among providers to throw it over the fence and let the users get on with it. This often led to underusage, sometimes even no usage. The information might not be relevant to user needs, or the language used to present it might render it inaccessible, or the website might be poorly designed and virtually impossible to navigate. Such approaches haven't entirely gone away, and it's easy to see why, because the alternative requires consultation, co-design, and co-production, which are hard, messy, time-consuming, and expensive. Practitioners are busy people and don't always have the time to fully engage. However, in the absence of such collaborative working, there's a high risk that the eventual information product will not be fit for purpose. And Hewitson et al. In their 2017 paper evaluated 42 climate information websites and highlighted another risk. If information is presented in ways which are confusing to users to the extent that the wrong data is selected as a basis for decision making, what is the liability of the website owner? Fortunately, the emerging decision support tools and platforms do generally engage users at the design, production, and testing stages with the goal of delivering useful and usable information. And that brings me to my third question: is the information used? And in most cases, the answer to this question is we simply don't know. There have been few cross-platform studies and almost no longitudinal evaluations of the usage of individual tools and platforms. Generally, funding agencies seek to avoid the kind of long-term commitment needed to carry out monitoring and evaluation. Although we can track the Google Analytics, which will tell us the number of users, the countries they're based in, how many pages they visit, how long they're on the site, that doesn't tell us the important stuff: who the users are, government, private sector, and why they're visiting the site. What do they want to know and for what purpose? Knowing that would help developers to understand what tools and information are useful and what is not. It would also help to build a case with funding agencies for the updating of information delivery websites. Overall then, what are the future challenges for decision support tools and platforms? We're moving from the throw it over the fence mentality to a more holistic approach, seeking to effectively deliver knowledge about climate change and its risks and useful climate information for risk assessment in the broader context of the social, economic, and legislative landscape. What are the future needs? Some examples in the short term, and I can name many, are acceptance of the need for monitoring and evaluation of site usage and of the need to update tools and platforms on a regular basis. The recent update of the Climate Change in Australia website is a welcome recognition of this need. Greater attention to the need for co-production and a willingness by practitioners to give up their time to participate. Robust funding models which allow platforms to grow and evolve, staying up to date and continuing to meet user needs. And finally, linking climate change adaptation, disaster management and sustainability in the SDGs, and now perhaps management of the COVID and future pandemics. In the longer term, what does the future hold? How will the adaptation practice community, which ultimately is a customer for climate knowledge and information, evolve? Will there still be a need for decision support tools and platforms seeking to deliver useful and usable information to the non-specialist? Or will the adaptation practice community outgrow these tools? There will always be a need for information, so what will the next generation of climate information websites look like? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jean. And our fourth speaker is Russ Wise from the CSIRO in Canberra. Russ, welcome.
Thanks, Juan. And thank you very much to Future Earth Australia for the opportunity to talk to you all today. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm presenting from, which is the Ngunnawal people. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Okay, so I'm going to, I've got a brief opportunity now to cover quite an extensive bit of work that we're currently undertaking. And it's very much focused on how better understanding and trying to tackle this investment deficit that exists in Australia around disaster risk reduction, adaptation, and resilience. And I'll just be sharing our understanding of that and some elements of what we're trying to do, hopefully to stimulate some discussion. Just to start, I'm going to provide a little bit of the context. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, because I'm sure most people are pretty aware of all of it. But we understand that the costs of disasters in Australia for natural hazards are substantial. And back in 2015, it was about 10 billion per year, they estimated, and they projected it to be about 40 billion per year by 2050. And that excluded the effects of climate change. So these were very conservative estimates. And recent years have clearly indicated that there's a substantial natural hazards and disasters are costing Australia severely. We also understand that the gap between total costs and insured costs is growing, is large and growing as regions become uninsurable, and also where insurance is still available, it's starting to become unaffordable for many people. And so we also know that there's a lot of evidence out there, particularly internationally, that if we had targeted investment in resilience and adaptation, we could significantly reduce these costs. And if we actually planned for it, we could create additional value to attract additional investment. And we know that there's lazy private capital looking for productive investments to create socially beneficial outcomes while generating financial returns. So given all of this, there still remains massive shortfalls in public and private investment to reduce disaster risks, build resilience, and adapt to change. So understanding what are the challenges, what are the constraints to this why do we have this investment gap? And a lot of our understanding at the moment has come from the last couple of years in working in an initiative called the Resilience Investment Vehicle, where we were working with NAB, IAG, Resilience New South Wales, and the Queensland Reconstruction Authority to try and find projects that we could have a resilience investment vehicle attached to it so that it would catalyze additional investment to deliver resilience outcomes. And we couldn't find a project that met the requirements of the investors to do that. And so what this revealed to us is that there exists a general and widespread deficit in competencies and capabilities. And by capabilities, I mean quite broadly to include data, methods, tools, processes, and governance, in order to be able to answer and act on the following questions. What and where are the things of value that are at risk of damage under climate change, and why? So our understanding is our existing or the prevailing methodologies and the competencies of those responsible, along with the necessary incentive structures, are all limited in helping us be able to fully understand and assess the drivers and the interactions. So let me try and explain all of this using this diagram. What this illustrates here is that we've got increasing levels of stress, and some of these are those chronic stresses, human health, land degradation issues. increasing inequalities, vulnerability, etc. We've got periodic stresses on top of those, such as drought. But then we've got these acute shocks and stresses acting on top of those. And then we get these compounding stresses, such as COVID-19, which hits us after a catastrophic bushfire disaster. And so the fact that our existing methodologies are largely inadequate or possibly underestimate the drivers and their interactions and the cascading consequences of those through our highly interconnected systems, and the fundamental systemic causes of our vulnerabilities and exposure, and the fact that we don't fully understand whose roles and responsibilities it is to actually develop this understanding and address the problems. What we tend to do is underestimate the current and future risks, and we probably place ourselves somewhere around here, maybe around. And as a consequence, a lot of our interventions tend to perpetuate the status quo. Whereas if we replaced ourselves here, we would, and we had the appropriate incentives to be able to do that and start to have the conversations, we'd be able to start to really understand and have conversations about the magnitude and the urgency of the changes that are required. But what we don't actually have is where do we need to go? What does a well-adapted and disaster-resilient future actually look like? And this is critical in order to provide a guide that for collective action, so that we get coordination around our efforts to deliver that. But we also need that in order to be able to assess what we're proposing today in terms of how well that will get us towards that desirable future, but also how well that will perform in that well-adapted future. So we need to be assessing our current interventions against that desirable future. We also need to be able to understand what the transition and adaptation pathways are and how investment in particular can contribute to these. And so that's a big focus of our work at the moment, is that investment aspect. And where are the opportunities to create value? And by value, we mean jobs, social cohesion, economic, natural capital, through investments in disaster risk reduction, resilience, and adaptation. And how can the public and private sector actors invest in disaster risk reduction and resilience? And by that, I mean government, business, and community as investors with an equity stake in these solutions. So tackling this investment gap, we've been working, we've got an initiative that's been going for about 18 months, and it's a medium to longer term initiative to really start to try and support in a coordinated way with all, because there are a lot of efforts in this space, the building of the required capabilities to underpin a nationally comprehensive and consistent approaches and markets to enabling investments in disaster risk reduction and resilience. Now, I only have a little bit of time now. I can't explain the entire initiative because it's quite an ambitious one and it covers a lot of areas, but I'll expand on one element of that, one stream of work. And this work is focused on collaboratively and adaptively developing and testing in applied settings a suite of the functions, processes, methodologies, data, and tools to support and enable diverse sets of stakeholders to be able to actually co-design, assess, and prioritize interventions in disaster risk reduction and resilience and adaptation that are actually fundable, that meet the requirements of the diverse types of investors that are out there in both capital markets and investors from government and investors from community. Now, this suite of functions, processes, and tools, they've been collated from a decade or more of efforts. And it's not, this is by many, many organizations out there. So it's about trying to pull all of this together in a meaningful way. And a lot of them have been developed for specific purposes or needs or particular sectors. And so it's about how do we bring that together in a meaningful but accessible and useful way. And so we're drawing on some of the stuff around resilience, adaptation, pathways and transformation approach, the Raptor approach. It draws on the resilience assessment and prioritization approach developed by the National Resilience Task Force, which try to highlight the need to get a handle on the values at risk to mitigate and avoid those costs, but also to really explore the value potential. How can we create additional value and capture that value to incentivize additional investment in disaster risk reduction? And then it's also about that monetization and funding delivery. How do we actually get these things funded and delivered in order to deliver on these outcomes. The work, the whole approach draws on the resilience principles and the checklist developed by Queensland Reconstruction Authority, and an understanding of the fundamental systemic barriers that are preventing us from being able to make legitimate, credible decisions around resilience, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction. And so just to, we're demonstrating these capabilities. And the important thing I think to emphasize here is that people can access any elements of these depending on where they are at in their level of assessment and maturity around these issues. And so we're working in, we're in Port Adelaide Enfield at the moment, where they've done, they've got a good understanding about the nature of their problem. They know what their priorities are. They know what the interventions are, but they're struggling to get those funded and delivered. And so what you can do is come in right at that point and say, well, these options, how do we explore who the beneficiaries are? If we implemented those interventions, who benefits? What are the benefits that they realize? How do we make sure those stakeholders understand and recognize that and have a role to play in trying to invest in the delivery of the creation of those benefits? And so the process then kicks in with some guidance, advice, tools, and capabilities to enable people to go a bit further and further flesh out and develop those options that are currently unable to be funded and delivered. What we often find, though, is as you start to do that exploration of the beneficiaries and the value creation, you're forced to go back and do a re-evaluation of the vision, because you often find their community has a big stake in all of that. And the diversity of stakeholders in that community actually wants their vision and their values to be represented in those outcomes. And then it broadens the systems analysis that's required. It creates additional sets of options. It broadens the opportunity space. And you are then able to have conversations about how to get those things funded in innovative ways. But you could enter into this at any point along the way. You might already have your options. And what you really are looking for is trying to demonstrate some resilience outcomes and how you could potentially get investors interested in funding and financing that. And as I've said, you can enter that into any of these, and these will be made available online and in an accessible way. So essentially, just to round that all off, essentially what we're trying to do here is, and some key lessons are, we need to involve investor perspectives early in the engagement and planning processes. And by investor, we mean community, government, and private sector. And there's a wide range of private sector investors as well. We need to identify and create opportunities for novel investments that create value and mitigate risks. So it's not just about mitigating risks and avoiding costs. Those arguments often don't hold much sway or influence to investors. It's about creating additional value through risk reduction. It needs to be place-based, regional in scale, community-led, and investor-enabled. We need to be able to assess and prioritize options in terms of how well they deliver and perform in a well-adapted and resilient future. So it's fundamentally important to understand where we need to be going in order to assess the interventions we want to deliver today. And finally, we need to build competencies and capabilities in doing and delivering things differently. This is not about building back the same or building back better. It's about actually building back or doing very differently. We need competencies such as systems and ethical leadership. We need anticipatory and adaptive learning. We need systems and values-based assessments. We need visioning, really being able to explore the future in imaginative ways, and authentic engagement and collaboration. And I know a lot of these have all been mentioned by the other panel members, so I think that's the consistency there is great. So looking forward to a nice discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Russ. We have 85 participants listening to you. So it's a considerable amount of people that are listening. Before we turn to them for Q&As, we have a short moment to respond to each other and to discuss among each other some of the many things that were mentioned. I am a bit overwhelmed by the all directions that the conversation can take, and it's impossible to do it in 10 or 15 minutes. But I'll just start by, one possible way forward for these 10 minutes is to how do we capture that political moment for transformative change that Lesley was talking about? I think we all agree of the need for intersectorial, multidimensional, multiscalar approaches. Lesley talked about expanding the spheres. Jean talked about the need for more co-production, maybe also add their civic epistemologies. But how do you see, what do you feel, or what do you think are still the main impediments, barriers, challenges? We all five are speaking related languages, but different languages. We're approaching similar conundrums and predicaments from different angles. We are academics, local politicians, economists. What are still the barriers for really, capitalizing on this political moment for transformative change across our ways of knowing and doing things? So just I'll start with there, and then I have another more specific question. So to frame it in another way, how do we bring the everyday and the emergency discourses together, the slow and the fast, those gaps that you were talking about? Anyone can start. Mark?
I don't really have a how, but one of the unfortunate things that's happened in Australia, and I think it's also happened in the United States, is that climate change has become a political wedge. So in countries like the United Kingdom, and I certainly don't say that they're perfect, even conservative parties are embracing the idea that there needs to be a determined effort to tackle climate change. In both the United States and Australia, unfortunately, climate change is used as a wedge to say to progressive parties that seek to push a climate change agenda that it's going to drive up the cost of living, to sow doubt around the basis for that. And I think one of the things we need to do in Australia as a conditioned precedent is take the wedge out of climate politics. I don't know quite how you do that, but I think while that wedge exists, it's certainly a problem.
So I would agree with that. And I also think it's, and that sort of adds to the fact that it's a lack of leadership for many organisations, and in particular, I think, for local government, that means that there is no action taken. And I think beyond that, in countries like the United States and Australia, the market is dominant and is king, really. And it means that there's a fear of any kind of regulation. Regulation is kept to a minimum. And I think that's perhaps the difference between what happens in Europe and what happens in the US and here, that in Europe and in the UK, and I'll separate them now because of Brexit, there is regulation to try and incentivize people with carrots and with sticks to take up electric cars, to install double glazing in their houses, to insulate and so on and so forth, in ways that doesn't happen here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Lesley or Russ? Russ, would you like to go?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And, you know, one of the things that we find useful is to say, well, what happens if you didn't have that contestation around climate change or the wedge? What happens if you had all that information that you needed for around climate impacts and the effects of all of that? You would still really struggle to get any kind of action. And so what we've found helps create that support, not just political support, but it creates the wider sets of community within a location. It gets government, community, business aligned with, is that shift to the value creation. And so what we've found is if you can bring together those diverse perspectives and priorities and motivations and interests and values, and you create an opportunity, and you bring in the ideas and the concepts and a process for them to be able to articulate the things that they would want to invest in, would be willing to invest in, to create the value of the future that they want. Often that gets around the challenges, the political contestation. We're looking to support at the moment. Bega Valley has a circular economy initiative which is starting to be explored. Now the circular economy initiative is fantastic because it's got all political support. It's bipartisan. It's got all the right ideas and elements and principles around it. And so it's about then saying, well, how do you make sure that if you're bringing in a circular economy, you bring in the climate and disaster lens into that and bring in the future considerations around longer term resilience. And so, yeah, to my mind, I think how we capture the political moment is frame it around what's important to the various stakeholders that have an interest in that. So yeah.
Lesley.
Thanks, Juan. So I think I would say that we shouldn't think of it as just one moment. There's a whole different layers of time and temporality in this, but it's true that we do, I think, have a political year with the lead up to the COP26 and so on, when we can exert increased pressure. We shouldn't forget that many things are happening, as Mark has shown us. There's a lot of things happening kind of bottom up, just because the federal, or perhaps because the federal layer of government has been the slowest to move and the most resistant. The local governments and cities and communities are doing lots of things. I think we can also, in terms of that wedge that was mentioned, we can look to rural communities for a lot of leadership here. So a lot of agricultural communities, which are very dependent, very conscious of climate change and thought of as socially conservative, but that's the kind of community that can perhaps bring people from different sides of the political spectrum along. So that would be one thing. And finally, I'd also say that, as other people have alluded to as well, emphasising the social benefits of communities working together, the many kind of non-climate change benefits of lots of other good things happen if we can improve our community life. I think that is another way to encourage people who might otherwise not care or be quite negative about the transformations.
I think you're right on the topic of the first question, Lesley, which is addressed to you and the panel from Tayana O'Donnell. How do we reconcile our multiple vulnerabilities, both individual and collective, and our emotional expressions of our now lived experiences of climate impacts, and channel this energy into the urgent transformation needed? Back to you, the Baton, Lesley.
Yeah, this is a very difficult question. I think we have to get away from thinking that some of the negative emotions that grief and fear and possibly anger, although not necessarily so negative, we can't let them paralyze us, but we have to channel them into action in certain ways. But I think the thing I would really resist is that kind of compulsory optimism, because I think that really puts people off, and we need to be able to be very upfront about the emotional work that we're doing and the emotional load that people are carrying. I think, COVID has helped us, as I said, to talk about this a bit more. So I've written about this in terms of, kind of bearing, BEAR, our emotions and our anxieties at the same time as we're undertaking the practices. But it's very difficult to do that.
It's very tough when you get those million-dollar questions thrown at you. Anyone else in the panel would like to add anything about that? We have another 3 questions lined up. Right, we'll move to the second one by Claudia Munera. She says, or asks, on day one, we talked about Indigenous knowledge systems. Yesterday on mechanisms to implement adaptation. In reimagining adaptation futures, what are the options, do you think, or opportunities to better integrate Indigenous perspectives on land and change to address social and environmental justice in Australia across scales and society? I may add also, opportunities for investment based on what Russ was speaking about. So who would like to go first on that one? I think, Lesley, you mentioned the discussion around cultural burning, how it became a prominent discussion, but also was invisibilized. Mark, as a local mayor, you deal a lot with integrating Indigenous perspectives in your sustainability plan 2040. So whoever would like to go first.
Well, I'll just say that I think in answer to the question, there are lots of ways, and there will be lots of opportunities. And the question of cultural burning is perhaps just one example. Another example is how well remote Indigenous communities have protected themselves from COVID by being very proactive in self-governance. So I don't think that, again, this is a very multiple answer, that the answers will be different in different places and different parts of Australia, but it also goes back to the question of who is this we are talking about, and making sure that the we should do this, or we have to think about this, is a quite diverse we, and we need to really think about all the different, including Indigenous perspectives, but also the many cultural differences in that we. That diverse thinking provides diverse resources and diverse ways of doing things. And so thank you for the question. It's a good signal to all of us to consider that diversity in all the kinds of actions we're taking.
Russ?
Yeah, I mean, fantastic questions, and I agree with Lesley. I mean, there are many opportunities and options available there. I think, and there's an alignment now. We're increasingly talking to a diversity of investors, and I'm talking probably mostly private sector. That capital market is made up of many, many different types of investors, and a lot of them are really motivated about delivering on exactly that. They really do want to achieve equitable, sustainable, socially desirable outcomes. So there's an alignment. There's a bigger alignment now than there ever has been in terms of the private sector interests aligning with traditional landowners' interests. We also we know of innovative mechanisms, cooperatives, for example, where people have shared equity to be able to invest and get benefits out of those things. So the institutional innovation, I think, is happening to enable these things. So that's another very exciting area that will be able to enable these kinds of opportunities to manifest. I know in the circular economy thinking down in Bega Valley, they really are looking at how to bring in the traditional knowledge around wetland management, water management, land management for carbon, creating transparent, equitable ways in which this knowledge can be brought in to inform investments, where you get that ongoing return back into that cooperative and back into the environment to deliver on outcomes that are desirable. So these things have been done before. We know how to do them. To my mind, it's very much, there needs to be a will. There needs to be incentives for people to do this. I think we also need to have the confidence. There are a lot of people that don't know how to engage and have the confidence to engage with Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous peoples on all of this. And then we need to have appropriate processes, inclusive, transparent processes to enable these things to happen. So yeah, those are just my immediate reflections. Yep.
Mark, did you want to say anything? Or
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Picking up from that point of engagement, I mentioned in my presentation that we have an engagement with Darug and Gundungurra elders around caring for country, and that's a very, very broad engagement. You do have to have both the will to engage and the courage to engage, and to accept that established norms and practices will be challenged, but also embrace the millennia of experience of caring for country that comes from First Peoples. So we've engaged. Caring for country is a big program for us, and I would only encourage other levels of government to similarly engage. It goes beyond burning practices, which are really important, to a whole range of ways in which country can be cared for.
Thanks, Mark. It was interesting to hear some of the details of Jean's work around adaptation, decision-making support tools and platforms. And I think Jean and you, Mark, have a conversation to follow up. As I understand, the Blue Mountains City Council is planning a sustainability toolkit to be co-designed and co-produced with residents in the Blue Mountains. So that's a lead up to the next question by Supriya Pereira, maybe to Jean and Mark or anyone. She asks, in Australia, what could the 3 key metrics be at each level? 3 metrics or activities at the national level, 3 metrics activities at the state level, 3 metrics activities at the local government, shire or council level, 3 metrics at the household level. So she says, if we tracked these 12 key metrics activities, we could be assured that we were all tracking moving towards a more resilient, adapted future. It's impossible for you to respond to this in 2 or 3 minutes, but maybe get your views around what would be, those key metrics that you may include in an adaptation decision-making support tool and platform, or maybe you're already doing that. Jean?
Okay, so I'll just go back to the previous question and just very quickly say that I think that we have a lot to learn from Indigenous peoples in Australia around communication of information. So it's a struggle to get information across through the decision support platforms and so forth that I spoke about. And one of the key ways to do it is through case studies. And we have found those one of the most effective ways to engage and to transmit knowledge. And I think if you're looking for the masters of case study development or storytelling in Australia, then you would look to Indigenous people. And then the ways in which they transmit information and knowledge across and down the generations is something that we really can learn from, and which could be a very effective tool for climate change adaptation. Just moving to metrics, well, my goodness me, where would you begin? Only 3. So I'm minded of the UK risk assessment, which is carried out. So it's mandated by law that they will carry out a risk assessment, I think, every 4 to 5 years, which will lead to an adaptation plan. And in that risk assessment, they do have indicators or metrics of progress. And I think, I don't know how many there were in the last risk assessment, but something like 30 or 40 rather than 3. So if I'm looking for an overarching metric, I suppose you would have to look at things like money invested in what you could term adaptation. The problem with adaptation, of course, is that it's very hard to capture and say this is a project which is about adaptation. Many things that farmers do are about adaptation, but they would tell you to your face that they don't believe in climate change, but then they will go away and they will do something about it. So how do you capture that action in a metric around climate change adaptation? So in the UK, these indicators or metrics have become very specific in the attempt to address that. So it's things like, what is the proportion of the urban area which is covered in concrete, and does that change from assessment to assessment? Can you see that it's declining as a proportion because that's what you're seeking to achieve? So there's a very woolly answer to the question, Juan.
Yeah, I don't think you can reduce it to 3 metrics. I think that what you have to measure is overall action. Obviously, you can measure emissions. So we're going to be emissions neutral by 2025, and that's a measurable thing. But sitting below that is a whole range of actions that are developing. Indeed, our knowledge of climate change and how to run a city while reducing emissions is developing as we go along. So if we were to tie ourselves down to some specific metrics now, we would possibly miss good causes for action. So for our city, so I'm not answering the question directly, but for our city, it's two things. It's measuring actions taken and assessing what those actions are. And then it's assessing in a practical, mathematical sense whether our emissions are in fact going to be at zero in 2025, and are they reducing? We've been able to measure physical decline of 25% in the recent short time. So for me, it starts with measuring emissions, and below that, gauging action.
Thank you, Mark. We're running quickly out of time, but I would like to squeeze in the last two questions and see how we go. The first one by Mark Stafford Smith. Do we have methods to systematically enable diverse sectors and regions to investigate and identify value creation through adaptation, and who might roll them out? Local governments? And then David Schlossberg asks, I appreciate the focus on investors and in identifying value adds, but we do still need to address the lack of action on the part of the federal government. What is the role of power here, and the very willful refusal to listen to communities and invest in adaptation? Post bushfires, without the power of the fossil fuel industry, and adaptation and resilience-led recovery would have been imaginable, rather than the gaslighting, gas-led focus of the government. What are some of the strategies to push for a federal focus on the public good of adaptation rather than the private interests of the gas and coal industry? So, Russ, I'll turn to you for that last question.
Okay. So you want David's question or both Mark and David's? Okay, I mean, an immediate response to David there around the lack of action on the behalf of the federal government. Excitingly, that's rapidly changing. The recent Royal Commission looking at governance around the natural disasters, natural hazards, bushfires, provided many recommendations, and the federal government responded very quickly to that and have committed to some substantial action. So they, my understanding is they're going to be setting up a new National Resilience Relief and Recovery Agency that has the mandate and the agency to be able to really drive an agenda in this space. And so that's very exciting. And also there'll be a new Climate and Resilience Services Australia created, which provides the technology and capabilities nationally to actually support those agencies better understand the challenges and support the various aspects, you know, in Australia at different levels to start to take action. So my sense is that things are rapidly changing, and I think we're going to get much more coherence across all levels of government in that space. Just to go back to Mark's question, I would say that no, I don't think we yet have the methods to do this systematically, comprehensively and consistently across diverse sectors and regions. But we are we are attempting to do that. We're developing those, and there's support at the federal level to really support that happening across levels and across sectors. And the rollout of that, I think, would have to happen with local governments, but I actually think SMEs and NGOs and communities have a big role to play in the rollout of these things as well. So yeah, that would be the immediate responses there.
Jean? I'm just turning to you because you had your microphone on?
Oh, well, yes, sorry, that was my mistake. I really don't think I have much to offer in this space, except I feel that international pressure on the Australian government will begin to bite, and that we will see quite rapid movement now that the US government has changed and takes a much more proactive stance on climate change and the need for action. Thank you.
Any final remarks from any of our Mark?
Just to pick up that last point, I think was an important one. The change of administration in the United States to the Biden administration, I think, is going to put pressure on the Australian government. They had a willing partner in denialism when the previous administration was in power. And I think now that that's gone, we will see pressure on the Australian government to change. I'm still cynical about the pace of that change and the depth of it, but ultimately it falls to the Australian people to urge the sort of action they want to see, and that's where people like all of us need to win hearts and minds.
Lesley, any final remarks from you?
Oh, just to agree with those last two comments about international pressure increasing. Thanks, David, for that question. I think it's an important one.
Thank you, everyone. I'm sorry that we have run out of time, but when do you think we can get Lesley Head, Jean Palutikof, Russ Weiss, and Mark Greenhill together in one panel? So I hope that you will forgive us for taking another extra 3 minutes. Thank you to the panelists. I would like to say that this summit convened by Future Earth Australia, University of Sydney, and Western Sydney University would not be possible without your generous time. What we're trying to do here is to convene people from different sectors to talk to each other and reactivate this agenda of climate adaptation in Australia. So thank you so much for your time today. Our next session will start at 1 p.m. Sydney time, and we hope to see you back at 1 p.m. Thank you so much to our 4 speakers today.